When Lionel Messi left Barcelona in the summer of 2021, it felt less like a transfer and more like the end of an era, a moment that shook football at its core. Because for the first time in over 2 decades, the man who had grown from a shy, hormone-deficient boy into the greatest footballer the sport had ever seen was walking away from the only home he had ever known, the club that shaped his identity, his style, his legend. And as he stood there in tears at his farewell press conference, choking on his words, the world began asking a question that had followed him quietly for years, but now screamed louder than ever before. Without Barcelona, was Messi still the best? For so long, Messi and Barcelona had been inseparable, two names spoken in the same breath, woven into the same story of tiki-taka brilliance, La Masia magic, and golden eras that redefined football itself. And critics had always argued that Messi's greatness was built on the system, on Xavi's vision, Iniesta's balance, Busquets' intelligence, and a club that had been designed around his strengths from the moment he debuted as a teenager, with long hair and fearless dribbling. But when financial chaos forced Barcelona to let him go, when the impossible became reality, the world finally got the experiment it had debated for years. Messi, alone, outside his kingdom, away from his comfort zone, in a foreign league under new expectations, new pressure, and no safety net. And what followed was not just a career chapter, but a revelation that redefined how greatness itself should be measured. His move to Paris Saint-Germain was supposed to be easy on paper. Superstars, money, dominance, but football is never played on paper, and Messi's first months in Paris were a shock to the system, not just for him but for fans who had grown used to seeing him glide through defenses as if gravity did not apply to him, because suddenly he looked human, adapting to a league that was more physical, a team that lacked structure, and an environment where he was no longer the emotional center. And for the first time in his career, Messi was doubted loudly, publicly, brutally, with headlines questioning his decline, pundits declaring him finished, and social media turning every missed chance into evidence that Barcelona had been the reason for his greatness all along. Yet beneath that noise, something was quietly building, something deeper than goals or assists, because Messi was learning again, suffering again, and redefining himself not as the untouchable god of Camp Nou, but as a footballer who had to adapt, sacrifice, and evolve. And that transformation reached its peak not in Paris, but on the grandest stage of all, the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. By the time Argentina arrived in the desert, Messi was no longer the young prodigy chasing legacy, nor the broken man haunted by finals lost. He was a leader shaped by pain, failure, and resilience, carrying the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders while knowing this was likely his last chance. And when Argentina lost their opening match to Saudi Arabia, the world laughed, mocked, and doubted again. But what followed was the purest display of football leadership in modern history, as Messi took control, not with arrogance, but with calm, scoring, assisting, guiding, motivating, and inspiring his team through every round, every challenge, every moment of pressure, until the final against France became more than a match. It became a myth in real time, a battle of eras, of destinies, of legacies, where Messi scored twice, created endlessly, and when the match went to penalties after one of the greatest finals ever played, the world watched as he stood with quiet certainty, knowing this was the moment that would define him forever. And when Argentina lifted the trophy, something shifted permanently in football history, because in that instant, Messi was no longer just Barcelona's masterpiece. He was football's masterpiece, complete, undeniable, eternal. But the story did not end there, because after conquering the world, Messi chose not glory in Europe, not another super club, but peace, moving to Inter Miami in Major League Soccer, a decision many mocked as retirement, as escape, as the final chapter of a fading legend. Yet once again, Messi turned doubt into disbelief, transforming a struggling franchise into champions almost overnight, filling stadiums, raising the level of an entire league, delivering goals, assists, leadership, and moments of magic that reminded everyone that greatness is not defined by location, competition, or age, but by influence, consistency, and the ability to elevate everything around you. And suddenly the question changed from can Messi do it without Barcelona to was Barcelona ever as great without Messi? Because the truth, finally revealed through years of evidence, was impossible to ignore. Messi was not a product of Barcelona. Barcelona was a platform that allowed the world to witness Messi, and when that platform disappeared, the greatness did not fade. It evolved, adapted, and conquered new ground, proving that true legends are not made by where they play, but by how deeply they change the game itself. And in the end, when we look back at Messi's journey, from Rosario to La Masia, from heartbreak to glory, from Barcelona to Paris, from Paris to Miami, from criticism to immortality, we realize that the truth the world finally saw after he left home was not about whether Messi could survive without Barcelona, but about how football itself had been blessed to witness a once-in-a-lifetime genius who didn't need a club to define him, because he redefined every club, every league, and every era he touched. And that is why, long after the goals fade and the debates end, Lionel Messi will remain not just the greatest player of his generation, but the purest expression of football the world has ever known. And yet, even after everything he had achieved, after the World Cup glory, the tears of redemption, the rebirth away from Barcelona, there was still another layer to Messi's story that only became visible with time, a layer that revealed not just the footballer he was, but the man he had always been beneath the spotlight. Because true greatness is not only measured in moments of triumph, but in how a legend ages, how he carries his legacy when the world no longer demands miracles from him, and how he continues to inspire without needing to dominate. As the seasons passed, Messi's presence on the pitch became almost philosophical, less about explosive dribbles and more about intelligence, timing, and vision, as if he had evolved into the purest form of the game itself, seeing football not in seconds, but in patterns, movements, and possibilities that only someone who had mastered every phase of the sport could recognize. And this evolution silenced the last remaining critics, who once argued that his brilliance depended on youth or speed, because now he was controlling matches with nothing but his mind, his touch, and his understanding of space. Watching Messi at this stage of his career felt like watching a grand master play chess while others were still learning the rules. Every pass intentional, every movement calculated, every decision rooted in decades of experience. And in that sense, his post-Barcelona journey became less about proving himself and more about teaching the world what football looks like when it is fully understood. What made this phase even more powerful was the way Messi embraced his role as a bridge between generations, mentoring young players not through speeches, but through example, showing them that humility can coexist with greatness, that discipline can coexist with creativity, and that true confidence never needs to be loud. And this influence extended far beyond the pitch, as young footballers across continents began to model not just their playing style after him, but their attitude, their professionalism, their respect for the game itself. And in a footballing world often consumed by ego and image, Messi stood as a reminder that the purest form of dominance comes from consistency, not controversy. And as time went on, something remarkable happened. The debates that once defined his career began to fade into the background, replaced by appreciation, as even his fiercest rivals and critics acknowledged what had become impossible to deny, that football had been lucky to exist in the era of Lionel Messi, that generations to come would study his goals, his movement, his decision-making, the same way historians study masterpieces, not to compare, but to understand how something so extraordinary could ever exist at all. And perhaps the most poetic part of his story is that by leaving Barcelona, by stepping away from the comfort of home, Messi allowed the world to finally see the full picture, not just the prodigy nurtured by a perfect system, but the complete footballer who could adapt, endure, lead, and inspire anywhere, under any circumstances, against any doubt. And in doing so, he answered the question that had followed him his entire career without ever speaking a word. Yes, he was always the best, not because of where he played, but because of who he was. When future fans look back on this era, they won't remember contracts, transfers, or controversies. They will remember the feeling, how watching Messi made football feel simpler, purer, more beautiful, how he turned stadiums silent with anticipation and then exploded them with wonder, how he carried dreams not with arrogance, but with grace, and how when he finally walked away from the game, he left it richer than he found it. And that is the final truth the world saw when Messi left home, that legends do not belong to clubs, leagues, or eras. They belong to the game itself. And Lionel Messi, in every sense, became football's greatest gift. A reminder that genius, when combined with humility and love for the game, can transcend everything, even time. As the years rolled forward and the echoes of Messi's final chapters began to settle into footballing folklore, something extraordinary happened. His story stopped being about achievements and started becoming about meaning, about what it truly means to leave a mark on a sport that has seen thousands of great players, but only a handful of timeless ones. Because Messi's journey after leaving Barcelona was no longer about goals or trophies or even legacy. It was about reflection, about the quiet realization that the greatest athletes do not conquer their sport by dominating it forever, but by changing how it is understood. And in that sense, Messi's final years became the most powerful statement of his entire career, a living reminder that greatness is not loud, not desperate, not hungry for validation, but calm, secure, and deeply rooted in love for the game itself. Watching Messi in these later seasons felt like watching the closing chapter of a novel you never wanted to end, where every touch carried history, every pass carried intention, and every movement felt like a farewell written in poetry rather than words. And what made it even more profound was the way he embraced this stage with peace, never chasing the past, never trying to replicate his younger self, but instead redefining what it meant to be great at an age when most legends had already faded into memory. He no longer needed to dribble past 5 defenders to prove anything, because his presence alone reshaped the rhythm of matches, slowed the chaos, created clarity, and brought purpose to every moment on the pitch, as if the game itself bent slightly to accommodate his understanding of it. And in this phase, something beautiful emerged. The world stopped arguing about him and began listening to him, not through interviews or statements, but through the way he played, the way he respected opponents, the way he celebrated teammates, and the way he carried himself with quiet dignity even when the spotlight faded, showing a generation raised on noise and controversy that true greatness does not seek attention, it earns respect. What made this final chapter even more extraordinary was how Messi's influence extended far beyond football, becoming cultural, emotional, almost philosophical, as millions who had grown up watching him realized they were also growing older alongside him, seeing in his journey reflections of their own lives, their own struggles with change, loss, adaptation, and acceptance. And in that sense, Messi became more than a footballer. He became a symbol of continuity in a world obsessed with reinvention, a reminder that staying true to who you are can be more powerful than constantly trying to become someone else. When Messi left Barcelona, it felt like the end of an identity, but in reality, it was the beginning of understanding who Messi really was without the colors, the stadium, the chants, and the history. And what the world discovered was a man who carried his greatness internally, who did not need a system to shine, a crowd to perform, or a narrative to justify his brilliance, because his love for football was pure, unfiltered, and unshakable. And perhaps that is why his story resonates so deeply, because in an era where loyalty is rare and authenticity even rarer, Messi embodied both without ever trying to, staying loyal to the game when the game itself was changing, and remaining authentic in a world that constantly tried to label, compare, and define him. As the years continue to pass and new stars rise, there will inevitably be debates, statistics, arguments about eras and numbers, about who was faster, stronger, more dominant. But what will never be replicated is the feeling Messi gave to the sport, the sense that when he touched the ball, something meaningful was about to happen, something that transcended tactics or rivalries, something that made fans lean forward in their seats with childlike anticipation. And that feeling, more than any trophy or record, is the true measure of his legacy. Because football, at its core, is not about numbers, it is about emotion, about connection, about moments that stay with you long after the final whistle. And Messi created more of those moments than anyone in history, not through force or spectacle, but through grace, intuition, and an almost spiritual connection to the ball. And when his final chapter is written, when the boots are finally hung up and the roar of the crowd fades into memory, Lionel Messi will not be remembered simply as Barcelona's greatest player, or Argentina's hero, or football's most decorated star, but as something far rarer, a timeless artist who turned a game into poetry, a man who carried greatness with humility, and a legend who proved that true brilliance does not belong to any one place, because it lives forever in the soul of the sport.